So welcome and good afternoon, everyone. So can you move the next slide? There we go. So our presentation, as you saw from the last slide, is organizational opportunities to address racial inequities. And both Steph and I are going to present it. And the way we usually introduce ourselves or start off in all meetings or presentations is with a process called name pronouns and utilizing where our role is as part of this process. So for me, my name is Beth Buxton. I am Director of Maternal Health Initiatives at the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. I self-identify as white, Irish, Italian, and Sicilian. I use the she pronouns. And my role in racial justice work is really to strengthen the work that I'm doing around white anti-racist, to be a stronger white anti-racist ally. And I hope to be a resource for other white people who are starting this journey or on this journey. But primarily, personally, my role is that of a learner. I've been doing this work now for 4 years, and it feels like I've just started this work and I have a long way to go. I recognize it's a journey and that I have made mistakes and that it's okay to make mistakes as long as I'm learning from that and moving forward from it. So I invite all of you to join us on this journey, and I'll pass it off to Steph to introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Stephanie Campbell. I go by Steph. I'm excited to share with you all today a lot of our lessons learned and provide some background knowledge. I identify as Black and I use the she series pronouns. And my role in this work is really to support Black people and other groups of color to think about what does solidarity mean, as well as to create healing spaces.
So both Steph and I would like to share that we are intentionally presenting this topic together as both a person of color and a white person. Structural institutional racism affects all of us, and we're trying to convey that information to all of you today. Co-facilitation in mixed race pairs can provide the opportunity to model cross-racial teamwork and understanding of respective roles and responsibilities for all of us in addressing racial inequities. We also recognize, we also recognize that conversations around race and racism can be a source of trauma for many folks, and it can cause feelings of discomfort and confusion. So we do ask that you please take care of yourself this afternoon and during our presentation. And if you need to take a breath or take a moment away from the screen, please do so, but we do hope that you return to us. Thanks.
And I know we're all now Zoom experts, but I think it just is always a helpful reminder there's a chat box icon, as well as opportunities to stop your video if you need to. We invite you to be on camera and recognize Zoom fatigue is something many of us has experienced. So do what works best for you. And just a reminder of the mute and unmute button.
So right now we'd ask you to just settle in. Look for a thing that's going to help you be here and be present for the next hour with us, whether it is grabbing a notebook and taking notes, whether it's making sure you're hydrated, whether it's readjusting or removing distractions. Really think about what it is that's going to help you avoid opportunities for multitasking and be present. And so we invite you to do that.
So I'm hoping you all have readjusted. We're going to do intros. I'm really excited actually that it's a small group of folks. The way you'll introduce yourself is your name and share your race and ethnicity as you feel comfortable. Share your pronouns. And what are you hoping to learn from today's session? You could use the chat box or you can unmute yourself. I will look for the first volunteer and then I will politely invite you by calling your name.
I'm happy to go first, Steph.
Thank you, Lynn.
My name is Lynn Brettel and I use she, her pronouns and identify as white. I'm hoping to learn language and how to have these conversations in a really much more frank and honest way at a systems level with particularly folks that I work with, in places where it feels uncomfortable, places where it feels like that would be introducing a topic, something that's off topic, even when it feels really relevant, and like the big proverbial elephant in the room, how to have the courage to bring it up in those settings when I feel intimidated to do so. So thank you for helping us with this journey, Steph and Beth.
Thank you, Lynn. Can I hear from Rena? Oh, I forgot, excuse me. Rena's having technical difficulties. I'm trying to move my screen around. Trina? Am I froze again?
No, did you mean Tessa? I don't think.
I thought I saw a Trina. Maybe I didn't see a Trina. Tessa?
Tessa or Christine is here.
There's a Tina too.
Oh, Tina. Yeah, Tina.
Tina, I did an R.
Oh, you can throw an R into my name. It's fine. I'm Tina Palmer. I use pronouns the she series, and I'm white, and I'm here to learn everything. So I'm trying to soak in all of this information as much as possible. So thank you.
All the fun things are happening to me this afternoon. The phones are ringing. It's like real life working from home. Christine?
Okay, I'm unmuted. Hi, everyone. I'm Christine Johnson. I identify as African American or Black and Black. As you feel, let's see. Okay, pronouns: she, hers, she, her, hers. And I'd like to learn how I can help my organization make inroads in this area. There was a previous effort a few years ago in a work group, but then the people who headed the work group left, all of them left. And so trying to figure out how we can kind of restart things or make some inroads in this area, even if it's one small step. Thank you.
And Steph, Bessie put her information in the chat. I don't know if you can see it.
I can't because I'm sharing my screen.
I'll read it if that's okay.
Yeah.
I am Bessie, a white Latina Puerto Rican. I use she and hers pronouns, and I hope to learn to integrate this into my work with youth.
Thank you. Tessa, would you like to introduce yourself? Tessa, if you're talking, you may be muted.
She actually just put it into the.
Oh, great.
Tessa self-identifies as Hispanic. She uses the she series. She's very interested in learning everything. Sorry, I'm having some difficulties. No problem.
No worries, Tessa. Thanks for joining us. Mary?
Hi, everybody. I'm Mary Green with the Iowa Department of Public Health. I use the pronouns she, her, hers. I identify as white. So the past couple of years at the department, we've had a couple of staff just within our Bureau of Family Health, really work with us on cultural competence. And then this year, really on racism, understanding structural racism. So it's been really good for me to really learn a lot of, I feel like I have a lot of aha moments, like that makes sense. So what would I like to get out of this? Like everyone has said, just more information, but where I struggle a little bit then is how to kind of incorporate it then. Like with the young people we serve, Iowa is a very white state. How do we, get more diversity? I've always said I'd love to have like more male facilitators, or how do we have more people of color in recruitment? So always looking for ideas or suggestions about that.
Thank you. Is there anyone that I may have overlooked? I think I got everybody. All right. I think we'll have some suggestions on what you all shared. We are experts in our own journey, and so I just want to acknowledge that we all come to the table with some area of expertise around this information.
So Steph and I have decided probably about 2 years ago, a year ago, that we really wanted to start all of our presentations with a land acknowledgement. And so for Steph, who's down by the Boston area, and for me, who's in the northern area, we want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Wampanoag people. It's a land acknowledgement is a mechanism meant to recognize and honor and respect the Native communities that are the traditional stewards of the land that we stand on. And so the Wampanoags, for those who don't know, are the most famous for greeting and befriending the Pilgrims in 1620. The Wampanoag community was the one that brought turkeys and corn to the Pilgrims and helped them survive that first winter. It was soon after that the British colonists started stealing the land and killing the Wampanoag community, which ended up turning into a war where most of the Wampanoag community was murdered or enslaved. The remaining 2,000 Wampanoag communities do remain on this property in this area. And it wasn't until 1928 that their rights as a people were returned to them and reclaimed and reaffirmed. So we just want to say that we acknowledge and honor the history that we have in this land acknowledgement, and acknowledge the Native people who are such a part of our lives.
And just one thing to add to this piece, here in Massachusetts, we actually get a lot of our town names from the Native folks, and it's not often talked about. Even the state, our state name. And I encourage you all, if you're not familiar, there's great maps so you can find out what Native tribes occupy the land that you are currently on as well.
So what is our goal here today? Steph and I's goal. This is providing you with an overview. The questions are, do we want to encourage more thinking and more talking about racial equity? Absolutely, we want to do that. Do we want to provide a brief historical examination of racism and its impact on health outcomes? Yes, certainly. Do we want to provide you with an overview of the work and the movement, the racial equity movement that we have here at the department? Absolutely. And do we want to introduce you to tools, racial equity tools and definitions and frameworks that may be helpful in your work? Absolutely. Under no circumstances, though, do we want to figure out who is racist as who is not. That's not the purpose of what we're doing here. We're really focusing on institutional and structural racism, and Steph will be able to provide further information on that.
So what do we mean by racial equity? So a definition is a starting place for a lot of this work. In our presentation, when we're talking about inequity, we're speaking specifically about differences that are avoidable, unfair, and unjust. Racism in particular, there are 4 different types. The first is internalized racism. Internalized racism looks differently for folks who identify as white versus people who identify as people of color. For people of color, it's often internalized through understanding, buying into what the system of racism means. So for example, oftentimes you'll see groups of color suffer from things like colorism. The closer you are or the lighter you are to white, feeling like there's additional value to that in your experiences. For white people, Beth is going to talk a little bit about what internalized racism looks like for white people. Beth, I think you might be muted. No worries.
My apologies. Yeah, so it's a set of beliefs and ideas for white people that that our beliefs and our values are they are the right thing to do. That is what is should be internalized. And yeah, it's also that's interpersonal. Excuse me. Yeah, internalized.
And then interpersonal is the one that many of us are most common with in the United States. This is when we're looking at racist examples that happens between 2 different people of racial groups. This I like to call is the mouthpiece of racism. This is the racism that we see in the media. This is the racism most people want to respond to. This is the place that I feel like actually stops us from moving forward in our discussions because no one wants to be called a racist. And in our society currently, feel free to interrupt me if you disagree. When a celebrity or anyone is called racist, the next thing they do, they go on TV and they have an I'm sorry speech. And that is a cycle that I feel like we're consistently stuck in the US. And I also wanted to say this earlier. We're talking about racism in the context of the US, not in a global sense. But there are global examples of racism that mirror certain aspects we see here in the US. The bulk of our work in particular at the Department of Public Health has really focused on institutional and structural racism. So institutional racism looks at policies and practices that create unfair differences based on race. Institutional is really critical in our work because it is also policies that are unwritten. Many of us work in government on this call. You know there are policies that people exist. If you ask why, where they came from, no one can find them. So institutional is definitely a place where we can begin to correct some of the inequities that we see, particularly in our health programs. The last form of racism is structural. Structural actually looks at the relationships between different institutions. So for example, you have education system, they have institutional policies that often, because many of us work with youth, result in unfair discipline and suspension policies. That is a clear example of an institutional policy. You have bankings. Beth is going to talk a little bit later about redlining. That's another example of an institutional policy. When you look at those relationships, that compounded effect, that is what we're talking about. That's structural racism. In addition, it's super important that we recognize the legacy of structural racism as we try to move our work forward. I also want to take a moment to say that structural racism requires collective action, and so does institutional racism. It doesn't matter if you only change one policy and there are several other policies that are playing or have an impact on that policy. We will still get the same result. Very similar here in Massachusetts. Our goal is that to achieve racial equity, which means racism no longer predicts life outcomes for all groups. Everyone's improved. Although a lot of our work, we talk about health inequities, we talk about disparities in health, I mean, you name it. And the thing that we never say is that white people actually are not that much more healthier than groups of color in comparison to other countries that are industrialized. So this system isn't working for any of us. The framework I want to introduce you all to is called groundwater. Is anyone familiar with the groundwater approach? I see a head nod. Christine, can you tell me a little bit in your own words what that means?
So it looks like, from my understanding of it, it looks at like upstream. So instead of like a lot of times when people talk about this, they reference like someone trying to rescue people who have fallen into a river, and the person comes to the realization, like, instead of trying to save people at this place, I need to find out why they're falling into the river. So go upstream and, you know, deal with things at that source or at that, you know, the causation. So I know that's a weird way of explaining it, but that's my understanding. It was like, look at source and root causes and stuff like that.
Exactly. Perfect. We want to make this plain. And I think that's a starting place. We can't be having conversations about racial justice and a 10-year-old can't explain or understand it. Like, that is what this movement, I believe, is going to take. Where we can eliminate jargon, we can invite people to the table because that's intimidating. I know someone mentioned earlier, like, I don't really know where to start in the conversation. Most people don't start because we're afraid we're going to say the wrong thing. And that's something that most adults, and no one wants to be embarrassed. So where we can say it plain, that's where we can start in building relationships and trust with people at the table. The groundwater approach is very similar to what Christine said. Most of our interventions are downstream. We focus on the individual, if we could change their behavior, and we hope for the best. So public health over the last decade or so has really moved into social determinants of health, which in this diagram falls in like the midstream, upstream area. What the groundwater approach is saying, it's before you get to upstream, what is actually in the ground, and that's structural. Oftentimes here in Massachusetts, we say, it doesn't matter if the Department of Public Health gets all of its shit together tomorrow. We have the most just policies if the Department of Education hasn't started, if the Department of Housing hasn't started. So that is really getting in the ground. What will it take to infiltrate each of these agencies that are in relation together, impacting people's health, and what that means for their life expectancy? Does that make sense to folks? I want to quickly talk a little bit about historical racism in America. So I think it's fair to say we took American history, I don't know, years ago at this point. Some of us remember some things of it, some of us not so much, and that's okay. But it was told, most importantly, from one particular narrative and perspective. It left a lot of people out. And so here lies, I think, another place that gets in the way of us having a racial reckoning in which we've all been experiencing for the last couple of months. I'll speak for myself. And the number of state-sanctioned violence and murders that it's traumatic. Like when I think about this, there's a whole generation of young people who are growing up seeing Black and brown bodies being filmed and murdered. Like, we have to do better. We can't wait any longer. And with that, I say part of that is because we don't even aren't aware of the historical racism in America. So this is just a small snapshot. America's a very young country in comparison to many others. And this starts at the 1600s. One of the things I want to note, this says Southern slavery in the slave codes. Slavery was also very beneficial to the North. That's where a lot of our financial institutions started. Boston is a port city, so the commerce and all of that was alive and well and also created our economy here. I think we do this thing in America like this part of the country is more progressive, this part of the country isn't. We all have ugly histories that we have to start to reconcile with. But during this period, there are three things happening. You have the enslavement period, you have lynching happening, and you have Native American removal of the land. And Native Americans have the worst health outcomes of everyone right now. They often aren't even in our data sets. And so that's telling when we're presenting public health data and they're not even included. The next period in the 1870s and the 1960s, that's where we have Jim Crow, redlining, which I'm gonna let Beth talk a little bit about. And then you have a lot of urban renewal projects and constructions of highways. Highways destroyed a number of communities of color across the United States. Lastly, where this lens of these three periods is where we currently are. Institutional racism, hostility towards immigrants, implicit bias, and public policy. I think we could go on and on talking about what the current administration laws and policies have really perpetuated over the last 4 years. In the next couple of slides, I'm going to turn them over to Beth, and she's going to name a few examples of what whiteness looks like in institutional laws here in the US.
Thanks, Steph. Yes, these laws have started back when slavery was very active in America, starting in 1676 with the Bacon Rebellion. People began to distinguish between African descent and people of European descent. Laws were enacted by white people, which said that people of African descent are hereditary slaves. Just like sit with that for a minute as a white person, saying that Black people are hereditary slaves. That's really uncomfortable for me. And the white laws increasingly gave power to white independent landowners and farmers. And so what we did here was provide you with a list of laws that you can look up yourself and explore. I will say the Naturalization Act permitted free white people to become natural. I can talk a little bit more about that. We normally say that slavery and freedom are opposite things, but they are diametrically opposed. But what we see in Virginia in the late 17th century, or after the Bacon's Rebellion, is that freedom and slavery are created at the same moment with the Naturalization Act of 1790. This restricted citizenship to any alien being a free white person who has been in the US for 2 years. In effect, it left out indentured servants, slaves, and most women. This implied that Black and later Asian immigrants were not eligible to become naturalized citizens, but it said nothing about the citizenship status of non-white persons born on American soil. The laws continued. We moved through the Trail of Tears and the Great Indian Removal Act and moved into Jim Crow laws. From there, laws continued, and some of you may be very familiar with this, but laws that continue to perpetuate whiteness through the 20th century. In 1967, a landmark legal case was heard where the plaintiff in the case were Richard and Mildred Loving. They were a white man and a Black woman who fell in love and got married. But this marriage was deemed to be illegal according to the Virginia state law. So with the help of the ACLU, the Lovings appealed to the US Supreme Court, which ruled unanimously that so-called anti-segregation statutes were unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment. So yes. So again, look at those laws. Yeah, go ahead, Steph.
I mean, I think the thing that I find most starking when we look at this, it's the intentionality of it. So when people say, how did we get here? You know, the enslavement period was 400 years ago. There were so many intentional laws that excluded Black folks and other ethnic groups. Their ability to buy in or get access to the privileges you can see is really only in the early 1900s. And so keep that in mind when you're starting your journey. It is frustrating. There will be roadblocks, but this is intentionality, 400 years of it. One that many people are familiar with this. Does anyone on this call know the story of Dr. James Merriam Sims? I see some head nods, some no's. Okay. So a lot of my work is actually in sexual and reproductive health. So I was just like shocked, like, how come I didn't know this? This wasn't in any course that I took in school. But Dr. James Merriam Sims has been considered the father of modern gynecology. Unfortunately, the part of the story that's left out is he got to this place by doing lots of experimental procedures, and particularly on Black enslaved women. We don't know many of the women's names, but that is where the speculum comes from. He was like the first precursor of that tool that's used when you get a GYN exam. He did these experiments without any anesthesia on these women, and it's disheartening. And so there's been a lot of advocacy over the last couple of years, particularly from medical students and other community activists, to remove his statues. There are two sides of every story. Folks who support the efforts of Dr. James Merriam Sims says he's a man of his time, which people could say that of us, right? We're people of our time. But in that, there is some level of disgust to be doing procedures, surgeries on women with no anesthesia. Once the method was perfected, he then started to do it on white women with anesthesia. And the anesthesia was new during that time. I will make sure we send the links to the stories, but as many of us are receiving federal funds for either teen pregnancy prevention or sexual risk avoidance education, like baked into a lot of that in particular is some of these racist ideologies. And I would also add too, the story of Dr. James Merriam Sims, we see this all the time. There's so many beliefs that Black people don't feel pain. That's not true. And it's really embedded from these historical moments and times. And you know, there's great books out there. There's Medical Apartheid by Harriet Washington. We have a great reading list that our department has put together that I will share with you all to show that you see the same things in history repeating themselves. All right, Beth.
So as we think about the Jim Crow era and moving beyond the Jim Crow era, there are multiple instances where government institutions enacted and sanctioned racist practices and policies. And you can see that in eugenics, you can see that in the Social Security Act, you can see that in the GI Bill, you can see that in the use of eminent domain and what Steph referred to earlier in terms of the highways and basically decimating communities. So the one we want to talk about today is redlining. And this is a residential security map of Boston, from Boston, Massachusetts. Redlining was a practice by the financial institutions across the country of denying and limiting financial resources to certain communities just based on race. It was basically racial discrimination in lending practices. And what they did in the Times was they would have these maps and they would take these red and yellow markers and circle these communities that they deemed to be hazardous. Those were the red communities, hazardous communities. And overwhelmingly, those communities were segregated communities of color. The yellow communities, I use those yellow pens, they deemed to be definitely declining, where there were more people of color in those communities than white people. Blue was considered still desirable, and green was considered the best. And what happened was people who lived in red, absolutely, and yellow defined communities, more often than not, were denied financial resources, lending, loans, for no other reason than their zip code. And it had nothing to do with their job. It had nothing to do with their credit history. It had nothing to do with their ability to pay back a loan. It had everything to do with racism and racial discrimination. And so for me, when I started learning about this, it was really hard for me to come to terms with, because I really needed to start reckoning with my own white privilege. So for me growing up, my parents were definitely not wealthy in any way, shape, or form. However, they lived in one of those green communities, and they were able to access a loan to buy a house. And it was an old farmhouse. I mean, we're not talking a mansion here. It was an old farmhouse where we used to cut wood for to cook and to heat our home. We had an outhouse out back. We still had the old pump where we would pump the water for all the farm animals. And that's how I grew up. And with time, you know, my parents, as they both worked, they were able to get loans for a car. My dad had a 1935 Ford pickup, which I know today is probably worth a fortune, but back then it was worth nothing. And they were able to do improvements on the house. I mean, I remember the time we finally got oil heat. It was amazing. And finally, my parents were able to send all three of us kids to school. And it was because of this redlining and because of my white privilege that happened. And that people just like me, but for whatever reason, were living in a different community, never had that opportunity. It was taken away from them, and it completely denied that. And so it was one of those things, it's based a clear basis of racial discrimination against people of color. An example of my white privilege.
Another piece I want to add about our redlining maps is that this is actually the same housing segregation we see in Boston today in 2020. And so if you haven't looked at your own major cities redlining maps, take a look at them. I can almost bet that not much has changed, with the exception of gentrification. So pretty much anytime we see maps of Boston, any data point, it shows up the same way, because that's where folks who are most impacted are living. In particular, I just looked at the maps for Boston around COVID-19, same pattern. You see this pattern over and over again. The South End isn't as red anymore because it's predominantly white now, like I said, as a result of gentrification or displacement. But that's when my family's from the South, and my grandmother used to live in the South End way back when. Any questions before we proceed on what DPH is doing? I know that was a lot of history, so I'm gonna ask for you to take a breath. I read this article that people are not breathing on Zoom, and I kind of believe that sometimes. We're just like here. So please take a breath if you haven't, but I do wanna hear like comments, reactions, because that was a lot of history and a lot of information.
Thank you all for sharing. And it seems like you guys I applaud the fact that you're covering a lot of ground. I was like, they're really ambitious. This is awesome that they're going into this stuff in the amount of time that we have. Also, I'm glad, Beth, that you brought up your background and your acknowledgement of your white privilege, even though you didn't grow up with money, because I have heard people who are white say, oh, there's all this talk about white privilege. I don't see it. I'm poor. I'm PWT. Da, da, da. I don't have any privilege. Just because I'm white doesn't mean I'm better off. Like people don't get that, like, if you are from a group that has been systematically oppressed for over 400 years, that it's not just about, oh, I don't have any money. I'm not better off than these Black people, because, just because I'm white, and people don't get it. Like, they don't know the history. They don't understand like how deep it goes, or people from who are white, who come from immigrant backgrounds, those people, they always want a handout talking about Black people and people of color, and they should just pull themselves up by their bootstraps. We came here and we did it, and they don't get like all the laws that have been put in place to keep things that the way they are. And so like when I hear people say that, I'm like, you really don't understand the whole picture, so that's very important for people to get that. And I appreciate you sharing that that acknowledgement, Beth. So I just wanted to say that.
Steph, I had a question about something you said early on about, we talk so much about health disparities and highlight, health outcomes for Black or Indigenous, other people of color. And your comment about, white people for the most part are not any healthier, and the system in the United States isn't really working for any of us. And I get that. And I'm wondering how to bring that up perhaps as a white person without having it sound like, all lives matter and pushing back against the structural pieces that historically lend, themselves to health disparities and poor health outcomes. I'm just wondering if you have thoughts about that.
Yeah, and Beth, feel free to jump in. The reason why I name that, because I think it's important in the context of the US for white folks here to realize like, you're not actually doing your best either. You're actually doing just better than those who are doing worse. And the easiest data I feel like where I see it listed the most is around maternal health outcomes when we look at all the nations on the list. And that the United States is at the bottom of that oftentimes. And so I think you could integrate it in like a nuanced way without sounding like all lives matter, to say like it's in our system. Like I think part of what white folks, and I'm not white, but this is my best Black guess. Let me just say that. Beth, feel free to jump in. But I think it's so important when I've seen like white people stay the course is like, they understand that like their liberation and their well-being is also intertwined. And the only way I think for that to happen for some people who are super heady and not in touch with their feelings and their heart is to see that data, to be like, well, in comparison to this country, you're actually not well either. And that's where I think you can get some more buy-in for people to move along to continue. But it's just giving it that global context, because we often talk just about the US and then we don't think about the health of white Americans in comparison to the rest of the westernized nations.
Yeah, that was a perfect response.
Yeah.
What's that? It's like, you got to see where you get in. Because otherwise, if I was white here, I'm like, well, I mean, Black people are always sick. Latinos are always sick. Asians are always sick, because that's the way we present the data. And we're going to talk a little bit about that too.
Well, and I think in an effort to highlight the injustice or the disparity, all it does sometimes is end up just blaming again, right? Who's more sick and why.
And I mean,
so thank you.
Think about it in terms of TPP data. If you look at it, you're like, well, Latino girls have more sex than everybody. That's why their birth rates are so, and I mean, I think it's unintentional. And so that, I don't want to say too much about data because I know we're going to get there, but that is where our real power lies. We get to shape that narrative and elevate some of these structural pieces. All right, Beth.
Okay. So moving into the history of this movement at the Department of Public Health, the racial equity movement, which has only been going on now for 5 years, 6 years. It actually started with the murder of Michael Brown Jr., who's pictured here. And he was murdered by a Ferguson police officer named Darren Wilson in Missouri. And so there was a team in the Bureau of Community Health and Prevention that Steph works in. They work in a division around injury, violence and injury prevention. And this really struck them in a way that they really wanted to do something different than what we've been doing all along. And so what they ended up doing as a team, just a small group of individuals, they hosted a 2-day racial equity training. not a cultural competence training, not a cultural humility training, not an inclusion training, a racial equity, racial justice training. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then they started gathering on a regular basis and having these conversations and thinking about how they wanted to move this forward, not only within their division, but within the Bureau. So the Bureau of, we call it BCHAP. Steph's Bureau is BCHAP. My Bureau is Bureau of Family Health and Nutrition. We call BFUN. So BCHAP really started to take this on. And in 2016 and really started developing a mission and guidelines and shared definitions and vetting and identifying quality presenters and trainers for staff. And with the BFUN coming on with BCHAP in 2016, we started doing things like town halls, racial lunch and learns, looking at procurement processes to really think about what changes we can make internally and have that reflection on us around what we can do collectively. And I mean, you think about 6 years, 5 years as a long time for the Department of Public Health. That's not a long time. It took a while to get that culture and that group moving and moving forward to now it's really moved up to our commissioners level where they want to take on this across the entire department, which is a huge win for the work that so many people have been doing for the last 6 years. So if you want to go to the next slide, if you could do that, Steph. Yes, so our racial initiative, we had two main aims for BCHAP and BFUN. It was really to look at structural racism within our own policies and procedures and to work to eliminate them. And then to also foster a healthy and equitable work environment. There should be a lot more, but there are people of color who work at the department, and we do want a lot more people of color to work at the department. But we want to make sure it's a safe place for everyone to be able to work and to have these conversations. And through some of the things that we've learned, it's not. And so we want to make some changes. Both bureaus specifically targeted Title V, which we all work for. And it's because it encompasses most of the programs in both bureaus, and that it was a level, it was in our sphere of influence. We had some level of control. We don't have any control about what the commissioner is going to do or what the governor is going to do, which is nothing. But we do have control over what we're going to do in terms of our programming policies for Title V. And so that's what really has led the work for both departments and why we're doing this work. I will say right now, again, we are focused on building our own knowledge, our own skills, in our own capacity, and look at our own changes for different components of our work. But we recognize at some point, and we're just starting there, that we need to bring this out to the people that we work with, our key stakeholders, the communities that we work with, the agencies that we fund. So we're just starting there, but we've spent a good 5 years just looking internally.
So as Beth said, we have been working internally. That was an intentional decision not to go off and tell our grantees, like, you go address racial justice. And we hadn't even started looking at our own house, which is quite messy, I must say. So there are 4 approaches that we're taking to do that. We talk specifically about why we lead with race and racism explicitly, but not exclusively. Oftentimes when you want to bring up conversations focused on race, it's inevitable. Someone says, what about LGBTQ youth? What about X? What about Y? And so we're not interested in playing oppression Olympics, but really to say, like, if you take any of those other identities and intersect them with race, the health outcomes are worse. And so it's an opportunity, one, to have a real intersectional approach, but to lead with race first. Most importantly, we're taking accountability in this process. What is the role that public health institutions actually play in moving this conversation forward and addressing their own institutional policies? The next approach we had is new ways to use data. How do we use data to really elevate the institutional and structural impacts that we've been talking about? And lastly, there are a number of racial justice tools and materials that are disseminated primarily in BCHAP and BFAN, which is my bureau and Beth's bureau. There has been some more movement, which I'll talk about a little bit later, agency-wide, but there's pros and cons to that approach as well. I'm going to skip this for sake of time just to make sure we have enough time for questions, but I will send out this link. The gist of it is it's a video that looks at just the history of race and what each group, how it came to be. It's about 3 minutes.
So I know some of you had talked about data and what we're doing about data. I will say we are beginning this process. We have a long way to go, but this is what we started to do. So this data data graph you see in front of you is probably something you've seen for decades in the work that we do. This one is specific to infant mortality rates by race and ethnic background and utilizing vital record statistics to do this. And, you know, we've seen it. You almost become numb to this. And I have to, every time I look at this, I have to keep reminding myself to stop becoming numb, to recognize that each of these data points is a life lost. It's an infant loss, and it's a family that has lost a child, and to really remember that. I will also say that when you look at this, you know, anyone will look at this and say, look at that, the red line's going down, which represents Black, non-Hispanic. Their death rates are reducing. Isn't that great? What is the issue? What is the concern? What we're doing is working. Well, the reality is all of the infant death rates have reduced over the time utilizing this graph. But what you don't see and what is not clear is that the gap between the white and Black non-Hispanic infant deaths has broadened from 2005 to 2016. That's not clear here. And so what we've done is we've tried to look at a different way of sharing data. In the next slide, we all know that race is a social construct, and we're still struggling about how to make sure that that is incorporated into our presentations. But this slide also looks at birth outcomes and infant mortality. And what this explicitly says, and what we're trying to explicitly say here, is that white, Black, and African-American women are more likely to have their infant die than a white woman with less than a high school education. You cannot, and this is in Massachusetts, and you cannot explain this by social determinants of health. This can't be explained away by, we have to provide more prenatal education to Black and African-American women. We have to make sure that they have affordable housing. And we have to make sure that they're dealing or managing with their diabetes. You cannot explain this away by social determinants of health. And so we're really looking for ways to highlight the racial inequities. I know in maternal mortality, we just released a brief that's, the heading was racial inequities within hypertension cases for Black and African-American women. And I'll tell you, it took a while to get that approved. It took me almost 6 months. So we're working at it and we're trying, but we really need to be far more explicit about racial inequities with our data in our presentation of data. So this is just some of the tools that we're going to go through with you and talk and share with you about. It's all of these tools we have adopted within the Department of Public Health. I've participated in all of them in some way or fashion, or have tried to take a leadership role in some way or fashion. And so what we're asking, Steph and I would be asking, is that you think about opportunities for you to incorporate any of these tools or all of these tools into your organization, your program, your teams. So we can go through them and start with training. Training is key. If nothing else out of this presentation or anything that I say, please start with training. It is so important that, and I've said this before, it's not about equity training, it's not about inclusive training, it is racial equity and implicit bias and racial justice training. And so, you know, Steph mentioned Dr. Harriet Washington and the book that she wrote. I saw a presentation by her last night. She got me all fired up. She's been great presenter and trainer. I have to go out and buy her book. I haven't read it yet. But personally, I've done things like, have you ever heard of the White Fragility book? Amazing book for white people and white folk to really get a better understanding of why it's so hard for white people to talk about race. But I would do, if you're doing this in an organizational way, find opportunities to do a training collectively. And I know that's always a challenge virtually. But look, Racial Equity Institute, we've gone to, there are plenty of reputable agencies out there that do racial equity training. It does require funding. And for us, we utilize the Title V, again, funding to support that training. The groundwater approach, as Steph had talked about, there are great books and resources out there to do this. But what makes it so important is that you really need to have a shared understanding and the shared definitions. Like when we say these words, what does it mean? You have to start there before you can go forward in terms of making changes within your organization. And on an individual level, like I said, read the books, there's blogs, there's podcasts, there's movies. If you've ever seen the movie 42, bawled my eyes out on Chadwick Boseman. Incredible loss to us. The movie documentary 13th, like seek out ways to educate ourselves because we did not learn this in history class. I never did. I learned that Columbus was a great guy, you know, and discovered the world. That's what I learned. So seek out those opportunities for training. It is definitely where I would recommend that you start.
The other piece I would just add to what Beth is saying is it's important that your team or whatever, wherever you decide to do the training, that you all continue to do the same training. It's not helpful if you know, 2 people go to the Racial Equity Institute and then 2 people go somewhere else. We all did the same training at our department. That also helped us with language. And we also have a glossary that we use, that we give to new people so they can be clear on what our definition of racial equity means.
Thank you for reminding me of that stuff too, because it's not a training one and done. You're not one and done. This is an ongoing opportunity and continuation of trainings. And so that we do that here at the department. And I would suggest that you do that too.
Another tool that we use all the time is the introductions. So we modeled this today and you all participated. It's actually the way we start every meeting in our bureaus. We say our name, we say our race and ethnicity, we say our pronouns, and then we do a window check-in, which Beth is going to talk a little bit about on the next slide. And then the question can be anything down to, you know, what's your flavor of the week, you name it. The reason why we start our meetings this way is to reiterate, and Lynn, you named this earlier, like race is always the elephant in the room. And so this is our opportunity to practice saying our racial identity and get comfortable with those words. Now that when we first started doing it, absolutely it was weird. People were like, why am I saying I'm white? Why am I saying I'm Black? But now it's a part of our norm. So people don't really quite it's a little bit awkward for new people, but no one else is starting to think about it. Again, this is because someone might say, oh, I didn't know you was this. I didn't know you were that. And it also allows staff to kind of bond with each other around similar racial backgrounds. The other reason why the window check-in, oh, I'll wait till we get to the window slide, but it allows us to be able to support each other too. Because oftentimes, anytime you ask someone how you're doing, everyone says good. And that is not the truth.
Absolutely. Thanks, Steph. Yeah, I think with the window of tolerance, it was developed by Dr. Laura Carr. It's utilized a lot with the National Suicide Hotline. So you can Google Dr. Laura Carr. We're going to send you these slides too anyway. The window of tolerance, I think, and exactly what Steph said, is a way for us to start building relationships. And because you can't do this work unless you have really strong relationships with your team members. So the window of tolerance is, they use a 10-point scale, and 10 up or a negative down to a -10. And so none of us are 0 because we all have heartbeats. So we're not zeros, but pay attention to where you might be. You might be a 1 or a -1, and that's where you're doing good. You're able to participate. You're not multitasking. Your brain is focused, and you're coming up with great ideas, and you feel connected. So that might be a 4 for you. That might be a -3, but that's all defined by you. What it means to be high in your window or hyper arousal is when those times when you became distracted or fearful or undecisive, where you have these tensions and your just brain is flying all over the place and you really can't connect with what's going on. Could be 101 reasons why that's happening, but if you're high in your window, that's probably what's going, those are the experiences that you're having. If you're low in your window or hypoarousal, that means you kind of have that flat affect, you're shut down, you're really not taking in any information, you're not able to hear information. And so when we go around and share where we are in our window, I'm not sharing that, you know, my cat died last night and I am just so low in my window. I'm sharing, I'm really low in my window. And what that does is it allows everyone else in the room to know where I'm at and coming at that meeting. And it helps me and everyone to build relationships with each other. So, you know, if Steph comes into a meeting and says, I'm really high in my window, I'm like a 5 or a 6, you know, I'm gonna step up and, you know, if there's a task that needs to happen and I'm cool in my window, I'm in a cool place, I'm gonna take on that task and know that I don't want my colleagues to take on those tasks if they're dealing with something else at that time. It's a way of taking care of each other and taking care of that team. And so the window of tolerance is what we started with. It's kind of a neutral thing, and we've used it for years, but we're changing it up a little. We're trying different things. So in the next slide, you'll see some people are doing the weather check-in now. You know, so if I come in and I just came out of a tornado, you kind of want to let me alone and I'll be here and do what I can, but there's other things going on. Or maybe I'm just partly cloudy. People have also done, you know, what type of spicy flavor are you for the week? Trying to make it fun. It works better when you already have that team building established and you're close to your friends, close to your colleagues, who really are my friends, but also just to really support each other. And that's, you really have to do that first before we can engage in such conversations around race and racism.
My favorite tool, which is often referred to as the framing tool, this is an example of what I did for our teen pregnancy prevention program. And so under the traditional approach of a framing tool, you will see at the end that it's very much a downstream approach in public health. So the problem that I was looking at was that teenage Black and Latina girls were getting pregnant at an early age. And this is not language that I necessarily believe. I just want to say this is how you need to go through the framing activity, because we have the opportunity to frame whatever public health issues we're working on. So the problem was teenage Black and Latina girls are getting pregnant at an early age, draining public resources such as welfare. What's the cause? Who's responsible? So typically we say the cause is they don't know how to avoid an unintended pregnancy, lack of sexual health education, generational impact of teen pregnancy, cultural norms. The solution is to increase sex education access and also to increase LARC access, long-acting reversible contraceptions. And what values are highlighted underneath that frame? Underneath that frame, to avoid a teen pregnancy is a personal responsibility. It takes into context nothing other than like you had no information, so you didn't know, or you had no access to birth control. Under the racial justice approach, you reframe the problem, and it now says that youth of color, I have to move you all again. I got to get 2 screens. Youth of color receive inequitable access to sexual health education and opportunities for successful transition into adulthood, resulting in poorer access to health, employment, and other social determinants of health. What's the cause under that frame is looking at historical and current medical racism, disinvestment in community development in schools. Who's responsible then moves up to your federal, state, and local government. It takes all of it off of the individual. The solution underneath this frame is to invest in community stabilization in schools using a racial equity impact assessment to acknowledge that teen pregnancy is not the problem, that it's ultimately a symptom of structural racism. And the action that's needed in this one is to engage adolescents in creating solutions and start to address systemic racism that limits opportunities for adolescents of colors. And those values under the reframe is really getting at equity, justice, and shared responsibility. The thing I forgot to mention earlier that I'm going to say now, as you're addressing trying to move more upstream into the groundwater, it's not that you stop doing downstream approaches. We still need those. It's a downstream and approach. So we want to go downstream and we want to go upstream at the same time. Questions about reframing. Reframing is done, one, in groups, because the more brains you have around the table, the better you'll get at thinking about what the solution is. Oftentimes, what we've been doing in our office, because we've been reframing programs and particularly around sexual health, the solution has allowed us to start different partnerships or consider different strategies outside of education. So how can we give youth employment opportunities in these communities where we know oftentimes the youth and adults are fighting for the same low-wage jobs? So that's how we've kind of taken the framing work and started to implement it in programs.
So trauma-informed systems. So I'm sure most of you have been hearing about trauma-informed services, how we want to support trauma-informed services. And so we at the department started to think about this in terms of using a racial equity lens, and really started to focus our trauma-informed work so that it was looking specifically at race-based trauma, and recognizing and considering the interventions and the practices that we have. We must acknowledge the historical racial trauma that has impacted most of our communities that we work with. And so for us, what we wanted to do was move from a traumatized organization, or move from providing trauma-informed care to move to a healing organization. And so what does that mean? What does that look like? So one, I will say this San Francisco Department of Public Health is a leader in this area. They have a great website. So if you're really interested in learning more about healing-centered approaches within an organization, they are phenomenal. And what we learned from them, one, is the first thing is that we needed to have a baseline. We needed to do an organizational assessment tool. And so we had a small group of us, a mixed racial group, that developed an organizational assessment tool and administered it to a small division within BFUN. And it was only about 20, 25 people. So it was a very small pilot group to figure out how we wanted to do this. And what we learned from this is you'll see these 5 domains that came out from that organizational assessment. And the ones in salmon color are the areas where they decided, the team was saying we really need to improve on, and we're not addressing in terms of trauma-informed care. And then the green areas were areas where we were deemed to be successful. This assessment tool, so you'll see like one of our successes is around supervision and support. This assessment tool was not about individual performance. It was not to say this supervisor is awesome and this supervisor is not so good. It was really intentional to look at overall aggregate collective performance as a team, as a division that works very closely together. Our division is actually called Pregnancy, Infancy, and Early Childhood, AKA PIE. So we eat a lot of pie together. But that's our group, and really wanted to see where we needed to improve. And so the next slide came out, we developed some specific mechanisms to help improve and move us towards a healing-centered organization. Now, mind you, this is the first step and a baby step. We have a long way to go and we're still working on it. But some of the things that came out of that was the check-in, making sure that those windows of tolerance check-ins were happening regularly, because where people were at were important to know, where we could be supportive of our colleagues, whether or not we knew what was going on, we still could be supportive of our colleagues. Another thing we did was we were finding that, I'm sure you guys are finding this, is that people are having meetings back to back to back to back to back, and they never get a break. And so now, intentionally, we are ending our meetings 10 minutes early so that we can give participants a time to use a restroom or to decompress or to get a glass of water, to stand up, you know, just to be able to take care of themselves so they can get ready for the next meeting. And another thing that we started doing is what we call days of service twice a year, which we have, obviously we're trying to figure out how to do during a pandemic. But what we used to do is volunteer at some of the organizations that in the communities that we work with, and it's a day of service of volunteering, providing services. It could be anything. We did Cradles to Crayons, where we made up bags of clothing for kids who needed them. We worked in a community garden and spent the day hoeing and picking up rocks and planting, which is not my strength, but I gave it my best in doing that. The goal of that was really team building. We got to know each other on a different way, in a different mechanism. And of course we had pie for lunch because we were pie. So those are just some of the ways that we started thinking about transforming us going forward in terms of healing centered.
Yeah, I realized it gave me a big old warning. I was like, oh, I'm just talking to myself. So this slide brings together our elements of our racial equity work. So in terms of our internal culture, the things that are ongoing, we have town hall meetings. The town hall meetings are DPH wide. They're focused on racial equity. It provides updates. Anyone can attend those to get information about how to get involved. There's a monthly racial justice lunch and learns. Those happen. There's a broad range of topics, but it's another opportunity for us to really keep our culture moving. I think, Christine, you mentioned that your organization started and then the people who founded the group left, and so the work got stopped. This approach that we're doing with town hall meetings has kept our movement going with staff transition, because some of the people who did start this work are no longer at the table and the work is going on. And so I think as you're thinking about how to restart, casting a wide net ensures longevity of the work. The other area that we're really working on is policies and practices. So procurement is a major thing for all of our institutions. And that's the work group that I sit on along with Beth, where we're looking at how do we be more racially explicit in our procurements when we're putting them out? Are we naming structural racism as the cause of whatever the service is, in addition to our internal policies and practices around it? We're making sure we have reviewers of diverse groups of people. Is someone on the review team have a racial justice lens? Are all the reviewers being trained the same? That's like something we didn't even consider until we started doing this work. What actually is the procurement process? Starting this work, we found out my bureau does a little bit different than Beth's bureau. So once we started asking questions, we are also trying to streamline to make sure everyone has the same opportunities for equity. The procurement work group also is a support for people who want to reframe their program before they put it out. We're happy to think with them through that. So I'm super biased, but procurement is a place where I feel like you can create a small policy that will last the life of the procurement. Hiring, data collection, and then community engagement. Those are some of the other work groups that are also focusing. We have consistent capacity building. So I mentioned making sure you all have the same training across your organization. So we have the training, and then we had time what was called workshops and labs, where you could have a problem that you would go to a lab and those people would support you as a solution. In addition, there was work really about roles. There was a lab like, what is your role as a person of color? What is your role as a white person? So there was a lot of intentionality put into our process at the beginning and clarity on roles. We really believe, like, you all are friendly groups, so I'm not really worried about someone saying something off the wall, but if we were presenting to strangers, there could be someone having really, really strong reactions, particularly when we used to be in person, to the information that we shared. And whose responsibility is it to address a participant based on your racial identity training, based on your racial identity, excuse me. And then the racial equity facilitator training. So in our bureaus, we have a group of people who we call refs, and they're the racial equity facilitators. It's like, I think there's 8 of them. And so they're available to support different teams when they want to start their racial equity process, help them build a container to talk about their shared values. These people also have been key. Our bureau is currently going through a strategic planning process for the racial equity work. The refs led a lot of that work, and we'll be going into work groups to continue it, to really figure out where do we go now? Because this is a lot of the groundwork that we did, but we know that one is not sustainable. How do we get more buy-in? Because not everyone in our bureaus is actively engaged in this work. It is a volunteer. And then the commissioner, strategic vision. That's the last one I forgot to talk about. So our commissioner, she's been slow to the party, but she's wonderful. We now have another group called like Cross-Departmental Racial Equity Collaborative, where different bureaus are starting to, one, learn about the work of BFAN and BCHAP. And they meet, I want to say, I think it's monthly now that we're remote. And we're trying to make sure this work is aligned with the commissioner priorities, excuse me. So what are some of our takeaways? The first one, as I keep saying, just because we're leading with race and racism explicitly, it is not exclusively. This is an intersectional approach. There's room for LGBTQ folks at the table, folks with disabilities. Like, this is for everyone. We're just acknowledging this huge phenomenon first.
Another one is really keeping the analysis structural. And, you know, we say this a lot to our epidemiologists. This is not about you personally, but I found this to be true too when we looked and utilized the reframing tool at a program that I started and developed and I direct and have been for the last 15 years. And we used the reframing and you know, I started getting up in my window and started feeling very defensive and realized, okay, Beth, take a breath. This is not personal. This is about understanding my role in this institutional structural racism and understanding that I do have an opportunity to change it. So pull myself out of that and recognize that this analysis is structural, not personal.
The other piece is, we talked a little bit about this earlier, the systems that are failing communities of color are actually failing all of us. And this is so important to include. And I really appreciate you, Lynn, of saying, I don't want to sound like all lives matter. What we're saying is like something in the US is making everyone sick. And it is this system that has been created that we've all bought into.
Yeah, the other thing is really, it can be hard to be patient. You know, we've been working at this. I know I've been doing this for 4 years now, and it's hard, like, how far have we made a difference? Have we even started to make a difference? One of the things that we did was actually in our procurement group, develop a whole list of our whole history of everything that we've done and accomplished. And when you're able to sit back and look at that, you're like, okay. And just to celebrate those short-term gains, it's so important to keep people feeling like they're invested and they are making a difference. And recognize that it just takes time to shift culture. It's just it took us hundreds and hundreds of years to get here. It's going to take a lot longer than my lifetime to get us out of this.
And lastly, relationships and trust are the foundation of this work. It's super important that we really build relationships, authentic relationships with our colleagues to move forward in this. It can't happen without it. And I can't reiterate that enough. Like, we have to bring our whole selves to work. And I know that's a risk, particularly for folks who, you know, identify as people of color. Sometimes we don't bring our whole selves to work. We come to work, we do our job, we leave. But we have to really start to build relationships and trust to move this forward.
And buy-in from all staff is really important. And so I say leadership, but that could be just your team too. Think about your sphere of influence. For us, we did not start with our commissioner at all. It was within our sphere of influence, but we really needed buy-in from everyone participating in those teams, and then our divisions, and then out to our bureaus. It is a collective responsibility for all of us, and it's important for all of us to know that we do have a role. White people have a role, people of color have a role, and it doesn't matter what your job is. It doesn't matter if your job is the front desk security guard or the receptionist answering the calls. If you're managing invoices that for people to get paid, all of us have a role in this racial equity work, and it's important that each of us are supported in participation.
And then sit and learn from discomfort. It can be uncomfortable learning about history that you never learned. And maybe it's the first time you heard some of the things that we said. You have to be uncomfortable to get to action.
And I love this success. Steph found this and I'm like, yes, that's totally it. It's really what it looks like. It's just like this whole mess trying to get to that end. it takes a lot of time. Changing cultural norms as practice is the work, and you're going to go 4 steps forward and 2 steps back, and that's okay. It's really recognizing that it is part of the work. We are getting there, and we just get there together.
And lastly, before we open it up for questions, I just wanted to read this to you. It's like my favorite piece over the last couple of months, and I think more of a call to action. Whatever it is, coronavirus has made the mighty kneel and brought the world to a halt like nothing else could. Our minds are still racing back and forth, longing for a return to normality, trying to stitch our future to our past and refusing to acknowledge the rupture. But the rupture exists. And in the midst of this terrible despair, it offers us a chance to rethink the doomsday machine we have built for ourselves. Nothing could be worse than a return to normality. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It's a portal, it's a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our advice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. And we have some acknowledgements, our racial equity steering team, Southern Jamaica Plain Health Center. They've been helpful in this whole process for us. And that's us. Any questions? Thank you for listening and coming this afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.